Hello everyone, my name is Sreeja and I am from ENH iSecure. In this presentation, I am going to discuss about transform in identity now. In this presentation, first we'll have a quick introduction to transform, then we'll move to the syntax of transform, different types of input such as implicit and explicit input, and we'll talk about REST APIs and their responses related to transform. We'll also have a quick talk on simple use cases where transforms are needed, and then we'll move to different types of operations that are available, and at last we'll end this presentation by seeing some best practices in transforms. This blog is divided into 4 parts as part 0, part 1, part 2 and part 3. Let's begin part 0 of transform blog, where we'll be understanding introduction to transform, syntax of transform, implicit and explicit input, transform REST APIs and API responses. Now let's discuss about transforms in detail. Transforms allow you to manipulate attribute values while aggregating from a source or provisioning to a source. Let's understand how transform works. So we'll be providing input to a transform, transformation occurs, and the output will be returned. So the way transformation occurs depends on the type of transform operation we'll be using. If you understand this with an example, if a user wants to generate a unique username, then a different operation will be used. Usually we'll be using username generator operation. And in another scenario, if a user wants to convert input into lowercase, then a different operation is used. Usually we'll be using lower operation. So the type of output you need depends on the type of operation you will be using. And transforms can be configured using JSON object structure and upload them into Identity Now using transform REST APIs. I'll be talking about REST APIs in coming slides. And the input will be provided to transforms either implicitly or explicitly and will receive output based on the type of transform we use. We'll be discussing about what is implicit and explicit inputs in detail in coming slides. Now let's understand the working of transform with an example. Let's take lower transform. So the input doc is given to that transform, where the D is capital in the input and the lower transform is used to convert input into lowercase. So the capital D is converted into lowercase d. In this way, the transform works. And we can also provide multiple inputs to a transform. But this is based on the operation we are using. We'll be discussing about this in coming slides. As we understood about what transform is and what it does in Identity Now, let's move to the next slide where we'll be understanding the basic syntax of the transform. Now let's understand the syntax of transform. Whatever the transform we'll be writing requires name type as mandatory components. If a user need to provide more configuration, then we'll be using attributes component. So name, type and attributes are three main components of transforms. In name component, we'll be giving some name to the transform, which is used to refer particular transform in REST APIs and Identity Now UI. And the type is the transform operation we'll be performing. This will determine the output. And the attributes are configurable objects which determine how the transform works, and each type of transform operation has different set of attributes. Now let's understand this syntax with an example. If a user want to convert input into lowercase, then user should give name to the transform and the type as lower, which is one of the transform operation. And this is used to convert input into lowercase characters. Now whatever the input user is providing will be transformed into lowercase. As we understood the skeleton of a transform, let's move to the next slide to talk about different types of inputs. Inputs can be provided to transforms either explicitly or implicitly. If we are not providing input through input attribute, Then the input is taken implicitly from the configurations we have provided in identity profile. Let's understand this with an example. Here in this transform, I have provided type and name. I didn't provide any input to the transform. So the input is taken implicitly from the configurations which we have provided in identity profile. Now let's have a quick demo on implicit input and then we'll understand what is explicit input. Now let's see the demo of implicit input. So this is the transform which I'm going to use. So in this transform, I didn't provide any input attribute. So the input will be taken implicitly from the identity profile configuration. Now let's create this transform. Done. Now let's apply transform to lifecycle state attribute. Let's see the attribute value before applying the transform. You can see the attribute value is in uppercase. Now let's apply transform to this lifecycle state attribute. Let's see the attribute value. You can see the attribute value is converted to lowercase, which means transform use the attribute value from the identity profile configurations. We have an idea about implicit input. Let's understand explicit input. If we are providing input to the transform explicitly using input attribute, then it is called as explicit input. The system's input is ignored in favor of whatever the transform explicitly specifies, which means if input attribute is provided, then system ignores the implicit input. Let's understand explicit input with an example. Here I have provided input to lower transform using input attribute, which means whatever the configurations that I have provided in identity profile will be ignored and the input I have provided in the input attribute will be considered and converted into lowercase. Let's see the demo of explicit input. So here I have taken an example where the input is taken explicitly by using the input attribute. And whatever the input that is provided through the identity profile will be ignored. Let's create this transform. So now let's verify this by applying this transform to any attribute. I'm going to apply the transform to last name attribute. So before applying the transform, let's see what will be the attribute value. So before applying the transform, the attribute value is this one. So let's apply. Let's see what will be the output. So you can see the attribute value is taken explicitly from the transform. So whatever the configurations we have provided in the identity profile are ignored. As we understood the way to build a transform, now let's understand what are all the REST APIs available for transforms. SailPoint have list of API to upload transforms to tenant and also to update, delete and retrieve the available transforms. There are 5 REST APIs are available for transforms in v3 and beta APIs. They are list transforms, create transform, transform by ID, update transform and delete transform. List transform API is used to get list of all the available transforms from the tenant. Create transform API is used to create a new transform and upload it into the tenant. and the name of the transform should be unique. It should not match with the names of the existing transforms. Transform by ID. It is used to get the details of a particular transform. Here we'll be specifying the ID of the transform whose details should be retrieved. Updated transform API is used to update any existing transform. We should provide ID and update transform to this API for updating the transform. Here we cannot update the ID, name and type of the transform. Delete transform API is used to delete any transform using transform ID. Now let's have a quick demo of transform REST APIs. Let's understand how to retrieve all the available transforms from the tenant. This API is used to do that. So provide the base URL which includes tenant ID and the domain. Now click on send. These are all the transforms available. You can also use query parameters if you want to filter your response. Now let's understand how to create a transform. First, we'll be writing the JSON body of the transform, where the name of the transform should be unique. Now click on send in order to create the transform in the tenant. A response port 201 indicates request was successful and the transform is created in the tenant, and we'll be receiving the ID of the transform. So using this, we can retrieve this transform, delete or update this transform. Now let's understand how to retrieve a transform using ID. This API is used to retrieve the transform using ID. So we'll be providing ID in path variables. Let's provide. So now click on send. Here we can see a list of all the details about the transform are retrieved. Now let's understand how to update a transform. This API is used to update a transform using ID. Let's provide ID in path variables. I have provided ID in path variables and then provide the updated body in the body section. Now click on send. We have received the response code 200, which indicates successful request. So the transform got updated successfully. Now let's understand how to delete a transform. This API is used to delete a transform using ID. So let's provide ID in the path variables. So I have provided the ID in the path variables. Now click on send. Transform got deleted successfully. These are all the API response codes which we will be receiving. The response code will range from 200 to 500. The response code 200 indicates a successful API call and the output will be returned based on API. For example, if we use list transforms API, then list of all transforms will be returned. The response code 201 indicates that the transform have been successfully created. 204 indicates the request was successful, but there is no content to be returned in the response. We can see this response when we delete any transform. 400 indicates client error, which means requested body is invalid. 401 indicates unauthorized, which means there is no authorization header or if the JWT token is expired. 403 indicates forbidden, which means the user you are running as doesn't have access to this endpoint. 404 indicates not found. which means requested URL refers to a resource or object that doesn't exist. We usually get this response code when we try to retrieve, delete or update a transform by providing invalid ID. 429 indicates too many requests, which means there are too many requests in a given period of time. The retry after header in the response includes how long to wait before trying again. 500 indicates internal server error, returned if there is an unexpected error occurred. As we understood about API responses, let's move to the next part to discuss about use cases and some transform operations.